They sent me overseas. I got to the Hawaii, and the colonel looked at my logbook, and he says, "You're about as useless as we could get. How did you get here?" I said, "Sir, I came by," and I almost said boat, but you don't say boat to a Navy man. I said, "I came by ship, sir." And he said, "Well, you'll never leave the island." 2 days later, I was in Espiritu Santos. I'm now put in a pilot pool. We were fills, replacements for those that were shot down or those that had dysentery. So anyway, in the pool, I was now the bottom of the totem pole, 21 hours of fighter time. And finally, some general that knew Pappy from way back got a hold of him and said, "Look, you want to go back to the Pacific?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "We'll get that AWOL thing discharged." And they did. Pappy come back to the Pacific. That is when he became our commander. And he took the replacements pilots and formed them into a squadron.
So I reported into Coronado and to the general, and he said, "Okay, Miller, I want you to go down, you're a major now. I want you to go down and form a new fighter squadron in El Centro and take them overseas." I said, "General, that's a very high honor, and I really do appreciate that, but I want you to know I've never, ever served in a Marine outfit of any kind. I've been attached to this Navy." He said, "Go on down there anyway, Miller. You're a major in the Marine Corps, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, sir. I don't know how or why, but I sure am glad." And I went to El Centro, and wiser hands prevailed, and they assigned a captain, Major Max Reed, to command VMF 217 instead of me. I would be the executive officer.
We were asked to volunteer to form a new squadron in El Centro. A number of us did volunteer, and we went to El Centro, and we formed this squadron, which was called VMF 462. We had always been told that we would go out as a single unit, but lo and behold, the Commandant of the Marine Corps changed his mind, and we were sent out as replacement.
When I got to 462, which is in El Centro, I flew wing. They gave me a lot of flight time. I'd fly 2 or 3 hops a day there at El Centro. Others maybe get 1, and to build up the time and the experience.
The squadron that I served in on Okinawa was Marine Fighting Squadron 224. It was part of Marine Air Group 31, the 2nd Marine Air Wing. The squadron commander at the time I joined the squadron was Major Hammond.
We all got orders to the South Pacific, and they loaded us on a ship, and off we went.
We were sent up to the Middle Solomons, to Vela La Vela Island. 212 was relieved by VMF 223, and Major Marion Carl was the commanding officer of that. It was his 2nd tour out. He'd been in the Guadalcanal and done so very well there. He had nobody except himself as a major. So somebody decided that they'd take a couple of majors out of 212 and put him in 223, and somehow or other I was one of the two. So I was made major. I was 23 years old, and I became the executive officer to Marion Carl. So we flew, and we did a lot of flying in that Corsair. Every aspect of tactical training you could possibly figure, we did.
When I checked into the assignment base in Japan, I think it was Iwakuni, and the check-in officer said, "Well, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that you can take your choice. You can either go land-based or carrier-based." And so the fellow that I was flying with didn't have that many hours in the Corsair, where I had done nothing but fly Corsair for 8 years at that time. So I thought about the dust and sleeping bags and tents and everything on Okinawa that we had during the Okinawa campaign. I said, I think I'll go out on the carrier because they've got napkins and a tablecloth and showers every day.
We lived in what they call Follies. It was just a little wooden frame house, and it had bunks on each side.
The living conditions on all of the bases were pretty meager. One day it'd have Spam and hash, and the next day it'd have hash and Spam.
Guadalcanal was a mess, a muddy, stinking, dirty mess.
Cactus is what they called it, but there was a lot of mud there, so it was quite a question. but it was bad. Bad quarters, tents that leaked, and at the beginning of the war it was very bad. The airstrips were not very good, but they made it. There is my first malaria, and it nearly got me 3 times.
One place was particularly bad, and that was Munda, New Georgia. We pulled in there. We were the first planes to land on that airport. In fact, they cleared the equipment off the runway, the graders and the bulldozers and that kind of stuff. They cleared off the runway so we could land. And we didn't have any facilities of any kind, and there were dead bodies laying all over the place. Not American bodies, because we buried those or do whatever you do with them. But there were dead Japanese bodies all over the place.
Early in the war, we went up to an island called Munda, staged up there, and a number of times we spent nights up there. Didn't have anything to eat. You ate crackers and sauerkraut for about a week, and coffee. So it's obvious that our stomachs weren't the best.
We all had dysentery and diarrhea, and I was down to about 130 pounds.
And, CBs became our friends. They would get us some fish, but there were times when we were really down for lack of food.
We got sick of eating coconuts, I know that. And we got pretty good at stripping coconuts apart and drinking the juice.
I finally got out to a ship that was out there, and they had, and I asked him, I said, you know, can we sign for anything? And they said, yeah, if you get some officer to sign for it. So I signed for some eggs and some steak.
I don't think that at our airport at Munda I ever saw the runway or the living quarters in the daytime. The truck would pick us up and go down the bumpy hill to the airport in the dark. And we'd take off and do our mission and come back, and then they'd take us back. And we'd go back to the living quarters in the dark at night.
We lived in right in a grove of palm trees with nice little huts that had wooden floors and screened in and all that kind of stuff. And we had pretty good food and like that.
When you watch the TV, you see about all this drinking and partying. No way, baby. No way. No girls, no booze, no music, no nothing. You came home, you sat in your bunk, or you went down to the mess hall and had your Spam and powdered eggs. That was it.
Had so much fun flying airplanes that I can't say it was any hardship. We could have had better mess halls and better beds to sleep in, but no problem.
That place when we were there was always muddy. And of course, when you had lots of men around and living in tents, you're running around everywhere, and it got muddier than ever. It seemed like every time it rained, and the typhoon would last forever.
We had the big rainstorms there, you know, and the mud deep, and I saw them actually paving some roads out there with crates of K rations. They'd put them down there on the ground, make pavement to drive trucks over, K ration boxes.
I have a friend who was on Okinawa for 4 months who spent most of that time in foxhole. Well, my living was pretty good compared to his. So we had Japanese snipers up in the hills, and they were sneaking in at night, stealing food, and you know, we walked double guard duty because you could get shot in a hurry, but we weren't up on the front lines.
Got some wood and carve a lot of airplane models, but we'd play checkers, play cards, drink Cokes. Coca-Cola company supplied free Cokes to all the troops over there, and I got in the habit of drinking Coca-Cola, and I've been drinking it ever since.
The ordnance officer always came around and made sure we had something to drink if we wanted it. I always had a bottle of Canadian Club underneath my bunk.
If you had anything to drink, you would have a drink, but there wasn't much of that around. And old Doc Reams, he was pretty careful in doling out the medicinal brandy, but the guys played cribbage and other cards and so forth. And if you weren't flying, you laid out in the sun, which you weren't supposed to do, but we did.
There weren't any ladies where we were, and you sure weren't going to send you booze when you didn't have much to eat. All I can remember eating is sea rations, and We hardly ever had any meat or milk or vegetables or anything like that. Once in a while you get a canned chicken and Spam and that kind of business. But once in a while a Navy ship would pull up and boy, they'd invite you aboard, and man, they had steaks and ice cream and air-conditioned bedrooms and all that kind of stuff, and we were sweltering down there in the heat. It was pretty hot and humid down there.
I had some seniority, so I had a nice big room right at the waterline. We called it Torpedo Junction, right amidships. My first roommate got shot down and killed, and then one of the other guys moved in with me, and he got shot down and killed, and then I couldn't get anybody else to move in with me. I couldn't even get the ship's company to move in down there. They were all thought I was a jinx.
We rigged our own shower thing with big gas barrels, metal barrels we cut into and run water into them and take our showers that way. But and we slept under mosquito netting all the time because you always took Ativan to prevent you getting malaria.
My squadron was to have gone to the airfield, NAFA, I believe they call it, NAPA. But one end of that airfield was held by the Japs and the other end by the Americans, so I couldn't land there. They took us on over to Hiroshima. So when we landed at Hiroshima, we didn't have anything with us. No tents, no food, no nothing. They just dumped us. But we managed to find a Jeep and a way down to the dock where it was about 3 or 4 miles away, where there was some clothing and some food, and we found some food on the way back. And it wasn't, pretty soon we had tents and the whole thing.
We did put up our own tents. We'd lay down a wood floor, and we stole a truck and piled a bunch of lumber up on it and several barrels of fuel. This is the first day practically.
When we were up at Okinawa, we lived inside of an old Japanese revetment. And that gave us, we thought, maximum protection against activities at night, Japanese bombing and that sort of thing. And we also had our rocket table there where we made up rockets inside that revetment, and our excuse for being there was that we needed to be there to give some security to that ammunition.
Early on in the campaign for Okinawa, it rained a lot, and the airstrip was really in disrepair. Japs had bombed it, we had bombed it, and they came back and strafed it and bombed it, and so there was a lot of mud holes, a lot of potholes. We had just worked ourselves to a frazzle. We had loaded the planes for the same strike, I think, 4 times, and it was aborted about every time. I mean, it never got off, and so we'd have to go take off all of the ordnance and take it back and put it in the revetment or back in a bomb dump or someplace, because you didn't dare leave the planes all out there loaded with armed ordnance. And they said, "There, your boy is out there in the water." And I looked out there, and here's this guy standing, you know, in a big puddle of water on 1 foot. Then he'd stand on 2 feet. Then he'd raise the other foot up. And I went out and I said, "Are you okay?" And there just wasn't anybody in there. And so I got him back to the parachute tent, and we called Corpsman, and he called the doctor, and they evacuated him. He had just gone into shock. That's all I can tell you. And we had a couple of instances of that, and I guess Okinawa was noted for stress, and I guess probably a lot of it was because of the length of the campaign.
When we were on Yantan, living in this great big Quonset hut, it was some hot, and most of us slept naked on a cot. But what you had to have was we all wore these great big Marine Corps field boots.
and you don't want to go walking out on a coral island with your bare feet. You're about to get in real trouble. So we'd have at the side of this cot, you'd have your field shoes. I used to keep mine open so I could just slide right into them, and I kept my .45 pistol. One night, an air raid comes out, and as we come out of the Quonset hut, there is a photographer. There's a photographer who takes a picture of us coming out of the Quonset hut. And they caught me, remember, strip stark naked, putting on my .45 belt with nothing but a pair of those marine shoes, and everybody else in the picture, there were about 4 or 5 others who were in the same condition. I mean, as stark naked as you could get, running for the foxholes. One guy'd be putting a helmet on, one guy'd be fooling with his own gun and such, but I'll never forget that. He developed the picture and brought it back and showed it to us. He said, I don't think I can do anything with this picture. And we tried to beg it from him, but he wouldn't give it to us.
Man's airplane, and being small, I had to use a cushion under me and a cushion behind me, and in addition to sitting on the parachute, in order to reach the pedals. And the first aircraft had little tracks that you put your feet in. You could see they made the bottom of the airplane a big plexiglass piece there, and the idea was you could look down through the plexiglass and see an enemy airplane coming up from underneath you. Well, that was great until you turned up the engine and the doggone oil would come out of those exhaust stacks and come back and cover that flannel. So eventually they made that metal skin. When they did that, they put a floorboard in the aircraft. So, because if you ever dropped anything down there, the only way you could retrieve it is to turn the plane upside down and catch it coming down in the air.
We had a Corsair that we were testing, and you would go into a dive and you get about 400 knots, and it would roll violently to the right, and you couldn't stop it. And so we tried everything, and then finally one day we noticed that they were changing the tail wheel on the airplane due to the fact that on this Martian matting and the guys would get up under the tail and lift it up with his back, and then they got to looking at, he had done this so many times that he had caused the horizontal tail surface to be dented, and that's the reason it was rolling to the right. We changed the tail surface and it was totally all right.
Some company drilled holes in the ailerons about 1/4 of an inch off from where they should have been, and you'd get an aileron snatch, and that wasn't a happy situation either. We checked our birds to make sure that the hole was drilled in the right spot.
When I was leading the 16 plane flight, and we were taking off southeast, and I looked back and I couldn't count, and I saw all this smoke, and of course we practiced radio silence and the thing, and I didn't know use in inquiring, and all this black smoke off the end of the runway, and I guess because my 16 plane wasn't there. He said that he had an engine failure on, and he got it back on the runway, and he tried to stop it. And he got to the end of the runway, and there was pretty much of a drop-off there with a road going around. And he dropped, as he went, he locked his brake. Plane went off the end of the runway and nosed up. And we always took off the prop planes with the canopy open. And he popped his seat belt, and he just flopped out. He was shot out of that plane as the plane went up. Hit on his feet, and I don't know, must have dragged and scooted something on the thing there. There was a CB coming in a Jeep around the edge of the field, slammed on his brakes, saw what was happening, stopped, says, can I help you? Can I help you? Michaels was his name, as I think I said. Yes, hold my parachute. He handed him his parachute and kept running. The funniest thing, we were kidding him about that. Oh, God. Of course, old Michaels later on had another accident. It's funny, and coming on the same runway line from the northwest, and he just spun into the heavy crosswind and got killed there. They were real tragic.
Dave fired off a rocket, and it blew up under his wing, and he had to sit down at the Chosin Reservoir. In cold weather, if they're jiggled and banged around, the ballastite will crack. Instead of firing and burning as they should, they'll explode. Johnny Theris and Rope Holland met him, and they were patting him on the back and carrying on. Dave just wasn't that excited about it. We quit carrying rockets, and we had 250-pound frag bombs at the rocket stations.
Yeah, I had a wing come off in a Corsair one day. So, but again, those were the days before they knew anything. They didn't know about compressibility or.
Then once in a while, they would send us a B-25 or B-24, B-17 bombers over there, very rarely, but when they did that, we'd have to fly at 25 or 30,000 feet to protect them. And every time we'd get up there, our engines would start cutting out, doing like that, which makes you a little nervous. So we came back and landed at Bougainville, and we'd tell our people in the engineering department, Ed Stivers was the head of the engineering department, our engines carry on at high altitude. And they'd get in there and they'd test them and they'd run them up and they'd do everything, and they ran fine. So finally we said, okay, Ed. So we took the littlest pilot that we had, Captain D. Penfield, and we built a little rack in the cockpit, and we put Ed Stivers in there right in front of the armor, in front of the radio, and put Deke in his lap, and he took him up to 25, 30,000 feet, and sure enough, the engines kept cutting out all the time. So they took them back and they found out the insulation on the ignition system would give way or something at that altitude, and it'd spark back and forth.
They cut the seat off in the back and took the armor plate out, and the mechanic, he didn't have a chute. So if something happened, both of you'd go down. You wouldn't dare jump out and leave a man with no chute in there. I took my plane captain up and we flew around, and he wanted to do some things. So we did some rolls and some wing overs and some mild things. He said, let's do a loop. I said, okay. Pushed over and got my speed, and I pulled the stick back and I hit my belly. I was sitting so far forward, I couldn't get it back, and there we're going straight up, and we fell out into a spin at a couple of turns, and I got it out. He said, that's great, let's do it again. I said, no thinking. I came home. One of these privateers, the Navy plane ahead, would look out the window. Nothing happened. By that time, it would tilt almost over, and everybody in the plane going looking out and see these two-headed pilot come by in the Corsair. Well, that was one of the lighter moments.
Only 2 times in my flying experience I really felt scared. And once was in flight training when we made a formation takeoff. Luckily the guy waited until we got to 500 feet instead of 200 feet to say to switch gas tanks, and I did this and turned the gas off. If he'd been at 200 feet when he did that, we wouldn't have made it. And the other time was once at the Esprit de Santos and dive bomb and run. I ran through a cloud at 2,000 feet, real fast with the elevator, and it had a tendency to have an aileron stall, and it turned it inverted at 2,000 feet. I did get out of it. But those were the only two times that I remember being really, really scared. Well, I got to this point.
Used to always talk to the factory reps about was high-speed stall, and in those days they didn't know what high-speed stall was. And you could be doing 250 knots and pull back too fast on the stick and it would snap on you. It did have a very mean stall characteristic. Squadron doctrine was that if you went into a spin, after one turn, bail out because it wasn't going to recover.
Corsair had a violent stall characteristic at that time, and they even taught us down there to land wheels first, come in, rather than trying to make a three-point landing that you'd been taught up to that time, because we were just losing too many. If you stalled out a little too high and that left wing stalled first, and then you'd come down the wing, engine, other wing, tail on down the side of the runway, and that was it. So they were actually telling us, tail low, but not three-point, and cut the power and let it roll out. And I'm sure I used most of the runway that first time.
Somewhere on the top of the loop, I stalled out. The other guy, either ahead of me or behind me, stalled out. And I remember the two of us coming down canopy to canopy towards you. I was looking him right smack in the eye, and he was looking at me right smack in the eye. And all I could think of, contrary to what the movies show, all I could think was, oh, that poor son of a gun's got to tell my mother.
This little thing here saved a lot of people's lives. This airplane had a very bad characteristic at first of a stall of flipping suddenly. And this made this wing stall a little bit faster so that you got more of a straight drop on it.
You wouldn't believe it. That works wonderful. And the true measure of it is when we always land with the cockpit open, and when it dumped, you got the wind dumping. You could feel it both sides of your face in the cockpit. And if you got it on one side and the other one, you'd better hang on a while yet, because you still had lift under.
Major Dobbin, Lieutenant Colonel at that time, and he said, go out and fly this new Corsair. That's the one I knew that he and a team had been working on it. Put the spoil on the wing. The first ones were plain old wood, and they glued it on with masking tape to make sure it did right. And then they put 6 inches extension on the tail wheel. They solved the thing about the landing gear without just hydraulics, where it just bounced and put some air and it would settle down. Bubble canopy. When I came back from my Great Lakes qualification, when we told me I'd go out and fly one of those planes, gee, man, it was amazing how you could fly and see.
The big thing that helped them out was reduce the sensitivity of the shock absorbers, because you cannot afford to have an airplane bounce when you're coming in for landing and bounce all the way over the barriers. Didn't have canted deck in those days, and so then and it happened, accidents happen. Guy would bounce over the barrier and go into people working up there, airplanes parked up there, ammunition parked up there, gasoline parked up there. Horrible.
This guy came down, and he had about that much off of all 3 of the blades of his prop. So I said, Lieutenant, what happened to you? What happened to that? He said, Major, what do you mean? Nothing. So you didn't feel any vibration or anything? No, sir. So I got in the airplane, and I ran up the RPMs and ran up the power and everything else, and sure enough, it was no vibration. He'd sawed that much off of all 3 of them, and they were balanced. He never did explain to me how he managed to do that, but I suppose he just got up too high and ground the prop down,
If that happened, the person would obviously be on takeoff. And if it shuddered badly, he would simply cut the engine and come right back. He wouldn't be airborne. At least I don't think so. But generally these nicks are not that huge, but they can grow. If there was a hairline crack, the thing would come off. And so they would have plenty of warning on takeoff, because that was at the highest point in which the plane revved up, and it would obviously magnify substantially. And I guess a mature pilot would know that you don't go anyplace with this kind of problem.
I don't know how to explain it. I guess you had a tremendous amount of self-confidence. And I go back to when I was talking about flight school, they built it up. When you're flying a fighter, it was the biggest ego boost in the world. And you were invincible. You know, period. You were just invincible.
It almost makes you super worldly. You know, you're tied to the ground here, and when you can fly, you've got another dimension, which is all we have to use, and it's just the way to go. And you see things you couldn't otherwise see, and you do things you couldn't otherwise do. And you do it faster when you're flying than any other way to go.
Manufacturers made 12,751. So the museum here has 2 of them. So what are the odds that you would have flown one of them? 1 in 6,370 or something like that, right? And I didn't know that I had flown this thing until Christmas of '49, when the wife of one of my friends told my wife that her husband flew it. Well, I knew if he flew it, I knew that I was flying when he was, that I flew it, because I did nothing but fly Corsairs. So I come back and look at my logbook at the time I flew with him, and I have it in my logbook here, 6 times that I flew this airplane here in the summer of 1952.
Which BU number was that?
It's Bureau number 97-349, I believe. 97-349, yes, sir, right there.
And I have no direct experience with this, but I know it happens. And if there's more than one carrier available in the fleet, and I've been in that circumstance, and a deck gets fouled or pilots get lost, and they can't get on their own deck, and they land on a deck of another carrier in the fleet, it's a cause for great celebration. They almost, the host carrier that they land on almost treat it as a conquest, or if they've captured somebody. They paint it. The thing has to be absolutely repainted and done over. And they send the airplanes back in such condition, it's humiliating to their home carrier. It's a tradition. I don't know where it started. And they compete to be nasty with each other. There's some minds need to be filtered before they put all that stuff on there, but this is all man stuff, so they can put stuff on there that doesn't get published, but it's pretty serious language. It wouldn't be fit for television, I'm sure of that.
324 on Midway, and we will carry a qualifying, and they just jerked us one day and said, go. So we went up to Okinawa as replacements.
We were at Santa Barbara and shipped out to Midway Island, then on to Guadalcanal and Bougainville and Munda, then back to a rest camp, and then back up.
Around August or June of '44, and they put us on a carrier, the Shipley Bay, and we had a whole bunch of the F4U-1Ds you see here. Although they were the 3-tank variety, and we took we took F4U-1Ds and SBDs over, and they dumped us off at Guadalcanal, but we were flying them up to Bougainville as replacements. So, but our squadron didn't get the 1Ds. There was a squadron out there with Kenny Walsh, who was the Medal of Honor winner, and they got all the new F4U-1Ds, and we flew the old FG-1s. We even had a birdcage, which was the early model.
And I went from 471 directly to Okinawa via Kwajalein and Guam. I flew at 155 in Kwajalein, maybe 50 hours. We passed guys going up from Kwajalein. We passed guys coming back, and they were beat. I mean, they were just total. Didn't even want to talk to us. And of course, once we got up there, I can understand they were why they were that way. They were kind of withdrawn, considering everything. And then I blurted out a few things. I remember we were sitting at the same table, and we were having powdered eggs and Spam. And I said, "Hey, this ain't bad." And I thought one of them was going to get up and kill me, because that's all he'd been eating for so long, you know.
Well, I got on a carrier. It was just a transport carrier. Had airplanes that were taken over there in San Diego, and we sailed to Guadalcanal. And there were about 25 pilots on it. We got off there and as replacement pool, and I was called for to go to BMF 223 on Bougainville. When I got there, a buddy of mine that left 2 weeks ahead of me was there waiting.
The Squadron 111 wasn't going to Okinawa, and the other two squadrons were going up to Okinawa, and I was ticked off about this. General Mulkey came out to the rest home, and I think I got had a few drinks, and I told the general off about, I want to go up and fight, and so forth and so on. My skipper was up there with me, a guy named Herring, and he and I were riding back out to base, and one of the two guys on the bus were talking about, you hear that 111 is being transferred? And of course here was the skipper of 111 sitting there, and he said, where are they going? And they said, you're being transferred from Kwajalein to Inuiatak. When we got back, the guy met me out to the airplane, and he said, I hear you're leaving. And I said, yeah, well, I know we're all being transferred. He said, no, you're being transferred to another squadron. And whether that general had anything to do with that, I don't know. But anyway, that's when I got transferred down to 322 at Esprit Santa, and they were going up to Okinawa.
Things seemed to go so slow. I remember the ship took so long to get out to the South Pacific. I was assigned to VMF 222, and that was an old squadron, but it hadn't been operational for a while. We had a 23-year-old skipper. Well, he wasn't much older than the rest of us.
The major exec of 224 didn't come back from a flight. I was heard out to be exec, 224, and wound up at Roy Namur, Mag 31, 224. Rudy York was leaving, going back to the States. Jeff Poindexter became CO, and I came in as exec.
We were slow going out. Finally got out to Okinawa. We were supposed to be dropped off. We went out on a carrier. We had no carrier training. We were supposed to be dropped off, but they decided to catapult us off, and we had no training whatsoever. The captain, he was kind of interesting because he wore a T-shirt, and I thought he was one of the guys that just ran around the place, But and we said, hell, we can't get off of this. We've had no training. He said, I'll get you off. And we hadn't expected that. And my particular plane and a number of others, of the 6 machine guns, 4 of them were loaded with liquor, and only 2 guns were operating each time. But he got us off, and the thing that was interesting is sort of that nobody knew how to set the trim tab. So when the first guy went up, everybody rolled the trim tab down. When they started to go down, everybody rolled it up. So we learned about the trim tab from the preceding people that went out there. And then we went in and we landed on Okinawa. The strip was half finished, really. And the first night we were in there, they started shelling us, and they knocked out, I think, 13 of the 30 planes we brought in.
In Okinawa, we went into Yontan, and it's kind of in the middle of the kamikazes. Every night we got kamikazes, and we jumped in the foxholes every night.
They sent me out with a whole group, I think I said, of about 800 on a troop transport as replacements and for increasing the size of the air wing on Okinawa because they were building up to invade Japan in October.
Finally got overseas to Roy Namur down in the Marshall Islands. When I disembarked from the ship at Roy Namur, and they lined us up on the beach. And that's when we found out what squadron we were going to go in. They started asking questions. How many of you can field strip the 20 caliber or the 20 millimeter cannon? I could. Every question they asked, I could do it. And they assigned guys to replace the mechanics, this guy, and all of a sudden there was 4 of us left. They looked at us and said, the rest of you guys are in the bomb squad. And I said, bomb squad? What's that? The guy said, well, we're the ones that load the bombs on the plane. I said, but I'm a mechanic. I'm a gunner,
We stopped at Kwajalein, and I thought, well, that was a final destination. Well, it wasn't. Evidently, it was just to pick up food or gasoline, and then the next stop was an island called Ulithi. And I thought, well, this is where I'm going to be stationed. And well, it wasn't that at all. So we finally ended on Okinawa.
We had to stop flying the planes and get them ready for transport, and they were hoisted aboard an aircraft carrier. As exact, I was sent with the ground echelon of the thing to establish the camp and get it ready. And then there was a flight echelon that went aboard the carrier and we catapulted off and flown ashore. D+6, I think it was, about April 6th, April 7th. I got ashore right after the landing at either the 2nd or 3rd of April because there was very little opposition. They walked right across Yantan. And LST pulled in and we unloaded and took everything that we had up and started setting up the area.
The Liberty ships stopped offshore. There was no deep water docks. Evidently they had lowered this cargo net or a ladder net, and we got our packs on and the sea bags were unloaded before then, and we just climbed down this thing into Higgins boats and then proceeded upshore.
When we got up to Okinawa, they launched us from, this is using a deck catapult. We were all joined up, we're probably about 100 miles or so from Yantan Air Base. I always seemed to be on the outer edge of the squadron formations. So I'm looking around, you know, and it was overcast. We only had about 1,000 feet between the water and the clouds. So we were all kind of flat formation, you know, out there. And here comes an airplane that looks like a Beechcraft, Twin Beech. And it just kind of flew by us as if we weren't there. And I know it had to be Japanese because we didn't have anything like that. And it was headed for Naha. But I couldn't say anything. I was supposed to be silent. And if I were to have gone out and shot at it, I might never get back because I was new in that area.
The schedule, the scheme rather, was 6 weeks in combat, 6 weeks out, 6 weeks in, 6 weeks out, 6 weeks in, and if you survived the third 6-week tour, you went home.
We started out with 28 pilots for the first 6 weeks. Now, after the 6 weeks, we had lost several pilots, and they wanted to expand our squadron, build it up to 40. So they took on 20 more pilots and built us up to 40, and that was for the second 6-week tour. After the second 6-week tour, the black sheep were just done away with, deleted. And most of us went on to another squadron, VMF 211, and they were known as the Wake Island Avengers.
In December of '51. Went over to Korea and joined Checkerboard Squadron 312. Was flying some of the same Corsairs I had just been flying at Cherry Point. They shipped them out. They lost a lot of Corsairs in Korea and quite a few pilots. And our briefing before I joined the squadron, where they wanted to make sure we had all our personal affairs squared away, they said, look at the fellow on your right, look at the fellow on your left. Now, one of you probably won't go home.
The second thing is, now we know that some of your friends, when the Korean War started, came over here and they only had to do 35, 45, 50 missions. But I have to tell you that you can't go home until you fly 100 missions.
I had orders to test pilot school and an engineering school. And of course, with Korea coming, they canceled those orders and I went back with my squadron, which was 214. The skipper was Rudy York, but he gave up the squadron and Walter Lescheid took over, and he was killed in Korea. Bob Keller took over.
And we kind of went up the ladder. You know, you're a wingman for a while, and then eventually you become a section leader. And then they, the good thing in World War II, you flew by experience, you know, not by rank.
Totally surprisingly, Marion Carl was taken out of the squadron and put into the Marine Air Group staff. And I suspect it was because he had, of course, engaged so well in the earliest days at Guadalcanal that they didn't want to, and he had also, he shot down 2 more airplanes during the short time that we were there. He was able to do that. So I guess they figured he'd done his part. although it didn't stop him from flying, but he was no longer in a fighter squadron. So I took over as commanding officer, and I was still 23 years old.
One of the people I used to fly with in the initial stage was the executive officer of the squadron, because he was brand new. So they made him section leader and I was the division leader, because we would be breaking in the new pilots, and we did it by experience, you know. I'm just a first lieutenant, but supposedly I knew what I was doing.
You know, I just did what anybody in that position should do, which is lead when you're in front, and be aware of your pilots. You know, you have to kind of watch them to see if they were being affected by the combat strain or anything like that. The people were doing their jobs, and they were doing them well.
You mentioned Major Keller. He was the CEO of a squadron out there at the same time, but I didn't serve with him until Korea.
I was always tail end Charlie. If there was 4 planes, I was 4. If there was 18 on the mission, I was 18. If there was 36, I was 36. So I always knew what everybody else had done.
My first tour, the commanding officer, Colonel Williamson, picked me to be his wingman, and I flew his wing, and also Keith Williams, his section leader, wing on those two, both wonderful men. And my second tour, I was in Hap Langstaff's division, flying wing on Chief Lou and sometimes on Hap. In my third tour, I was a division leader myself, but we couldn't find any Zeros to shoot at then. But we did a lot of strafing, and we lost people due to strafing. And
VMF 215 during World War II, and one other squadron was 321, but I was primarily in 215 and 321. I was aboard a carrier.
The colonel called me and said, I want you to go and take over VMF 321 and be the commanding officer. And I said, sir, I appreciate that very much, but I've been there almost a year, and my squadron's going to be going back pretty soon, and there are a lot of guys better than me. Why don't you just, Miller, get over and take over that squadron? They think they're in some kind of a Boy Scout outfit. They don't say sir to each other. Their engineering is only 50% available at any given time. You get over and you square that outfit away. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. So I went over, and I was a little annoyed, and I did something that you very seldom do in the aviation squadron. I had an inspection. I want to let them know I was there.
Esprit sent us up at Turtle Bay that someone found out there were a bunch of washing machines in the warehouse. And so we had, you know, the Marines have a tradition of acquiring midnight requisitions. So we got a bunch of washing machines, and everyone had their own washing machine to wash with. And then we found out there was going to be an inspection. So they took the washing machine, we took the washing machines out into the lagoon in front of us and pulled the plug. And
I'd been an enlisted man. I knew all the tricks and everything else, and it's not going to be that way anymore. This is a Marine military outfit, and everybody's going to do what they're supposed to do or else, and that kind of stuff. And I made quite an impression, because the engineering went up to 85%. We quit losing airplanes to any aircraft fire.
Well, I had an awful good relationship with our pilots, and I was basically their trainer. I was the operations officer of the squadron until I got the squadron, and we had a good relationship as far as that's concerned.
Well, of course, I all looked up to them. I was eager to prove myself. They had been through some pretty rough times in the Monday campaign, and well, I thought I was treated very well. I was just glad to be in the club.
He just knew when you went down the line in the Jeep, there's your airplane, and you looked, oh my God, not an old goat like that.
No, I was assigned an aircraft, and I went to it, and I had to give it a down on ground check and get a substitute. So they put me in a bird cage. And I said, geez, I don't know, I'm going to tell them, I'm the boss, you know, I'm going to tell them, get me another one, get me a regular airplane. Huh? And then, no, I guess not, I better take it. So I did. I took off with the bird cage, and I flew the mission and came back. And after it back, one of my wingmen, he was a first lieutenant, he says, gee, Skipper, he says, that's just wonderful. He says, usually they keep the bird cages for the lieutenants, and you flew a bird cage. So I felt good that I had done it, and I felt bad that I thought I might just pull my rank and tell them to get me a better airplane. So I'm glad I didn't do that.
Of course, we wanted to fly the later airplanes.
and but you just took whatever airplane they assigned to you, and sometimes you'd get an old birdcage canopy that had been out there for the entire tour, but you'd fly that one. You took whatever you got.
We served in Guadalcanal and then went up the slot. We went up from there, we went up to several other islands, Colmagary and Munda. We were the first Marine squadron, the first squadron back in occupation on Munda Island.
They took the island of Munda, and as soon as they took that airstrip, we went up there to take care of our planes coming in, you know, that had mechanical failure and everything.
I was the second pilot to ever land on Munda airstrip.
At first, we were flying out of Munda, an island called Munda, and we were attacking the island of Bougainville, and the Mud Marines were still defending that island, and we'd help them out, strafing in front of their positions or wherever they needed help.
And then from Munda we went to Bougainville, and most of our strikes were against the Japanese coming down the slot.
In 1943, the Corsairs were going from island to island hopping. The grunts would take over an island and the CBs would make a field and they'd move up to Vella or Munda and so forth up the line. They finally wound up at Bougainville and Green Island. And in our case, the Marines took a peninsula on Bougainville, and there were 33,000 Marines on that peninsula and 78,000 Japs on the rest of the island. And they were there all the time. We had three fields there. The dive bombers and torpedo planes on one and fighter planes on another, and the New Zealand P-40s on another. And we were flying missions basically to protect the bombers in their runs up to Rabaul to bomb that place out.
We were escorting bombers, B-24s and SBDs, the torpedo planes which we used as bombers also, sometimes some B-25s in raids over Rabaul. That was my second tour. In Vella, we covered the landings at Bougainville, and we did more. We weren't escorting bombers so much then as just flying combat air patrol and missions like that.
And finally, when we secured Bougainville and we could land there and take off from there, then we would fly up to Rabaul, which was the biggest Japanese stronghold.
People don't realize that initially we didn't have any belly tank or a bomb rack per se. We had an internal tank on each side that held 50 gallons on each side. So when we used to fly to Rabaul, we'd fly up on the wing tanks, purge them with CO2 and do your fighting and come home on your main.
Bougainville Island, which was a large island in the northern Solomons area, had been invaded by Marines and by Army forces, and a big beachhead established, including airstrips, which was the purpose of it, to get airstrips further north so they would be a base for aircraft that could then attack the Japanese further north, Rabaul area. And they had, I guess at least six airfields in the Rabaul area.
We were striking Rabaul. You flew from Vella to Bougainville and landed, and there they topped off the fuel tanks, and then if you were picking up the bombers when they got word that they were coming in or handy to where you could get on them, why you'd take off. The group would take off. And I mean, sometimes there was 24 planes, sometimes there was more than that, and there were planes coming from other airfields too.
They destroyed 400 Jap planes in 8 weeks on that run.
We operated down at Piva Yoke or Piva Uncle strip on Bougainville for 2 or 3 days, and we got shot at a little bit, but you know, we were just sort of horsing around until we moved up to Emeru.
The carrier comes in and they've got all brand new F4U4s, so they re-equipped the whole group. We were due to come home roughly. You did about a 9 months of tour and then you came home. Well, our 9 months was up, but they decided to send us to Okinawa because we were experienced. So all of us, we all got the F4U4s. We went to Okinawa, and our main duty at Okinawa was barrier cap, intercepting the Jap suicide planes coming down. And we did do escort. We escorted the P-38 photo planes over Japan, and the B-25s bombing the suicide field.
I was on the Bonhomme Richard, and we went to sea, and didn't do much of anything. We covered some landings, which I don't remember. We flew over Japan a couple of times, escorting the B-29s in, but I don't remember. To be honest with you, it was just all a blur.
Shamu Field was dug out by the Seabees. In fact, I had a letter not too long ago when I sent a picture into the Leatherneck. Somebody from a Seabee outfit wrote to me and said, well, you're talking about flying off that field and kicking up dust from that coral strip. He said, I was in there building that coral strip before you guys landed. And so we were all over the hillsides there. Every time a plane took off, you know, it was just like a dust storm going up.
Frequently, we would go out for close air support and then fly combat air patrol at 35,000 feet. And let me tell you, it's cold up there. And we wouldn't be really dressed. You know, we didn't know which way to dress.
We had 3 different missions at Okinawa. One mission was to cover destroyers and destroyer escorts which were stationed around the island. They were called radar picket patrols.
We did combat air patrols a little bit higher to try and intercept the Japanese when they came on into Okinawa, and then the third mission was strikes against Japanese territory, including the Japanese mainland.
The Air Force took most of the fighter sweeps, they being those that would take off and go out and hunt for, go up over Kyushu and invite them up. In the Marines, we flew the radar picket patrols.
Roger Peter, which is radar picket patrol.
The pickets were 3 destroyers, and they were the perimeter defense for the Okinawa. And they were stationed in various places around the Okinawa from 140 miles out to intercept aircraft or whatever.
The picket patrols were radars on Navy destroyers that extended the range of distance from Okinawa for the radar on Okinawa.
And they required low altitude formations. Down by low altitude, I mean 300 to 500, 600, 700 feet, depending on the weather. We stayed right close in around the destroyers to defense them against kamikazes that would come in. They also had a CAP, CAP, Combat Air Patrol, over them up high to do the interception.
So we'd fly cover for them, and they'd send out 5, 6, or 7 flights of 4 planes each and stack us at various altitudes above these Navy radar picket patrols. And any kamikaze that was going to try to hit one of those ships had to look down between, what, 15 or 20 red, maybe more, Corsairs doing all sorts of weaves and gyrations, and they were going to have to fly down through that. I think that's why so many of them came in low, and we discouraged the steep approach.
And a lot of times we would go to high cap, combat air patrol, circle up high, 20,000 above for anything, and we could be vectored then to anything coming in.
I actually was put in a tower on IFF interrogation. That's identification, friend or foe. And I was to monitor the good planes in and to be darn sure the bad ones didn't come through by sending up our aircraft and to keep everybody informed about who was in the air.
We'd get a vector, we'd just go out and try to intercept and shoot down what was coming in. And we were vectored south toward Formosa. I was flying number 2 man on Pop Carroll, who was our flight leader. I spotted the plane because of the sunlight coming across the water. And I spotted him, so he said, go ahead and take him. So I peeled off to take him, pulled the trigger, a beautiful shot. Nothing happened. No guns weren't charged. And Pop Carroll was right back up in, he did the same thing, no guns. And finally the 2nd Division splashed them. We got back to base hollering and screaming why our guns didn't work. And it so happened that afternoon they had a mission down the southern part of Okinawa. So they safetied all the guns, put color film in the cameras, and had rockets. So they took pictures of the guy in front of them shooting the rockets. We never took off with guns on say. The first hop in the morning, you would fire the guns, test firing.
and they would be hot all day except for a switch. And all you had to do during the daytime, when you need them, just hit that switch and your guns would fire. I got some beautiful pictures of that Kate with the torpedo hanging under him. Big red meatball right down in the water.
It's pretty hard to describe the feeling that really I don't remember going into combat being scared.
When Pappy said he was going to teach me something, that he did. He taught me to fly wing, he taught me to do gunnery runs, he taught me to hold my thumb up when the sun's there to block the Japs out from coming at you in the sun. He taught me many things.
Combat air patrol was a boring thing, you know, except for you're under attack.
Actual aerial combat, which is more fun than anything in the world.
Our first combat experience was flying from Guadalcanal up to Kahili, which was on Bougainville. Saw a few Zeros, but on the way back was our first tour. We were kind of green, and unfortunately some Zeros snuck behind our flight and shot down a couple of our boys. So we had our indoctrination in the combat was not a very happy day, to say the least.
We found after a while that the Japs had no armament. They would flame easy. They did not have purged wing tanks. So therefore, if you put an incendiary into them, their plane would catch on fire. He said, if you want to get these babies, dive at them, make a pass, and get out of there.
You get your briefing. You'd have a rendezvous point. And you get up and you get the squadron together, which is quite an effort all itself, getting 20 or 30 Corsairs flying in the same direction. That's a Marine Corps formation. Everybody's flying in the same direction. What they would do is they'd circle around the edge of the formation, and then they would come and they'd drop a phosphorus bomb. Well, the phosphorus bomb could be seen for 50 miles away, and of course all the Zeros then knew where the formation was, and they'd gang up on it. And so one of their tricks was to get into the formation and drop a phosphorus bomb so all of the other Zeros in the countryside would know where the formation was. Well, I caught one of them, and I must have caught him just after after he dropped the bomb. And I was so close to him I could see the bullets hitting his wing. They were making little triangular shaped holes. Starting small and getting bigger as they went along, probably 6 or 8 inches long, triangular hole. And of course the wing just melted, and he went into a graveyard. He didn't explode, didn't burn, but he went into a graveyard spiral. I think I must have got the pilot too.
First airplane that I ever shot at, it was coming at me head on. I'm looking, and here comes somebody, and he's turning his lights on and off. And I thought, that's crazy. Now remember, this is my first. He's turning his lights on and off. I said, what's he doing that for? It's midday. He was shooting 20mm shots at me, and I was flying at a skid, so he wasn't coming near me. So as a result, I said, this is a real one. And I had my guns charged, and I gave him a burst. As he went by me, he rolled, and he went into a ball of flame, my first airplane. When I got home, I got out of that airplane, I went over to a palm tree, and I stood there for about a minute and a half, maybe 3 minutes, and I relieved myself. And I'm telling you, that was something. And Pappy was so happy because that day we got 11 airplanes. We lost one pilot. From there on in, I had made my niche, and even though I was a kid with only 21 hours, people then decided in my squadron, which he formed from these replacement pilots, that this kid isn't so bad.
But in my own experience, some of the boys had already had a few victories, so my wingman and I decided today we're going to climb on the outside. We were escorting B-24s that day from Guadalcanal up to Kahili on Bougainville. Anyway, that particular day, George Cross, who was my wingman, who is no longer with us, decided, well, we're going to get us a bird today. So we swung out wide of the main formation of the bombers, climbed up to 30,000 feet. And I'll never forget, George Cross pointed on down, sure enough, there below us was 4 zeros. And we made our runs, and both of us shot down 1 0 and had a couple of problems.
Reinhardt Lou came upon a formation of valves, and he had them dead to rights. Behind him, like shooting ducks at a barrel. And he fired his gun and 1 bullet went off. He charged his gun again and 1 bullet went off again.
They started diving to get away from us, and so I followed the 2 of them together, but then they split, and 1 went left and 1 went right. So I had to follow the one, I picked the one going left. But they could turn tighter than we could. And I was having a tough time trying to get my weapons on that aircraft. I fired and I got some, hit his wing, but I didn't kill him. And so he got away from me.
We could outmaneuver a Jap over 200 knots, and they just couldn't turn left. The ailerons just froze, and they just couldn't turn. So we took great advantage of that, and finally learned how to combat a Zero, because it was just duck soup.
Oh, the Zeros came after those SBDs. One time, well, they had dropped their bombs, gone on the dive and dropped their bombs at, I think it was Rabaul. Yeah, or either Ball or Bougainville. And they level out. Well, of course, they're very vulnerable after their dive because they're at low speed and low altitude. And I've come, of course, we're going pretty good speed because we're circling down at as maximum speed, really. And here was this SBD over to one side, and there was a Zero right on his tail, just about to lower the boom on him. Well, I went after the Zero. I started firing out of range, but of course I was not at range very long. I don't know if I hit him or not, but he flipped over and went the other direction. And as I went by the SPD, the tail gunner waved at me. But he was glad to see me.
And we operated out of Vella La Bella, and then later they took Green Island, and we operated from there for a while. And it was there that Bob Keller's squadron later on had Lindbergh flying with him. And he wasn't supposed to be flying, you know. He was an Air Force pilot, but he was supposed to be a civilian.
When we were there, Charles Lindbergh was there. He was flying the Corsairs, and he got himself a Jap. He shot one down.
And later on in the war, the Japanese came up with a George, which had a big engine, and it was highly maneuverable, built all on the lines of a Zero, and we had to be careful with those because they could get on our tail and shoot us down.
It was a George, I think, and I got smoke when I fired, and I got one problem. Well, that's all that I got.
When I was making a run on a Japanese Zero over Rabaul, and as I was coming in shooting at him, a plane went right by my nose from my left. I couldn't even identify it, but we came that close to a mid-air collision. He didn't see me, I didn't see him. Well, fortunately, the plane I was after, I did get to shoot down.
Bob Owens and I were escorting B-24s, and we had dropped the bombs. Of course, they missed the target, as they frequently did. And anyway, Bob takes off, and he's flying after flying through the Zeros. He's not going any place, especially just trying to get home. And I'm right behind him. Well, the Zeros would tail in on Bob, and of course, doing that, they'd be right in front of me. So I blasted away. I must have hit 5 of them at this one time, and I only got 2 confirmed out of it, but ran out of ammunition.
First plane off Guadalcanal was the F-4F, and then we got the Corsair. And on the first day,
First flight in the Corsair, I shot down 5 Japanese Zeros. And I had a flight of 8 and got into a flight of about 12 Japanese Zeros, and I happened to be able to get 5 of them, and we got all of the 12.
One time I was, I think it was on Monday, I was on a strip waiting for my plane to come in. We always waited for our planes, and Boynton went by and he waved his hand like this. And later on I went over to see him. I said, what's your, he said, I got 5 planes in one hop. So that made him an ace right there.
We had gone up on a fighter sweep, and lo and behold, I was up 20,000 or something, and lo and behold, I saw a half a dozen Japanese fighters coming up down below there, and then went into a dive, and then I pulled out behind a Japanese fighter and pulled my trigger, and just as immediately when I pulled my trigger, I realized I had to pull away because my closing speed on him, if I didn't pull away immediately, we would have a mid-air collision. So I pulled up and away, and as I saw, I looked over my shoulder, and I could see he was shooting his guns by the flashes, but he was nowhere near aiming at me.
So you just circle basically for sometimes 3 or 4 hours, and some of these flights get into be 6-hour flights, just circling. And my first plane, Val, that I shot down was that type of thing. We were circling this thing, and they got a contact and went out and intercepted him and shot him down. There was no opposition because we just went in and shot him down. He was probably about 400 or 500 feet flying, heading south for the ship accumulation and apparently go to fly in one.
They were coming in. We knew that because they would be right on the deck or something, and the radar wouldn't pick them up.
If we were assigned to bomber escort, I figured that then that's what we do.
His name was Bob Owens. He said quite a few things, but one thing he was pretty adamant about it. He says, you're not out here to shoot down Zeros, you're here to escort these bombers and make sure they get home. And we did. I don't think we lost any bombers.
If we were taking bombers out there, I stayed with the bombers, and if the Japs saw you there, they weren't going to come close, and if you went chasing them, then the other Jap would come in and harass the bombers.
I shot another 3 down out of the formation. We'd have this formation of B-24s or sometime SBDs and TBFs, and we'd be weaving over them, and the enemy airplanes were off to one side trying to get into the bomber airplanes. And if they'd get too close, we'd go after them. I was able to get 3 there and ended up with a total of 6.
One day I came out of a cloud, a cloud layer. I came out of a cloud, and I looked to my right, and geez, I'm flying formation on a Zero. And I looked over, and he smiles, and I smiled back, and I went up in the cloud because there's no way I could maneuver around to get on his tail.
I'd like to tell you a little about Chris McGee, who shot down more planes than anybody in the squadron other than Pappy Boeington. And he was from Chicago, like I was. And he used to wear a red bandana around his forehead. Now, this guy was a free spirit. I mean, he wasn't afraid of anything. And he was out there to win the war. And he was a heck of a good pilot. He shot down 7 fighters and 2 bombers, so 9 planes, which won him the Navy Cross, which was something for a fighter pilot to get. He thought nothing of it. He says, just don't give me medals, let me shoot those bees down.
We got to Villa La Vella, and we started our routine combat missions. What had really happened is there'd been an awful lot of resistance by Japanese air during this invasion, and they got pretty well beat down.
We pretty much dominated the Zero. And when I say Zero, I'm talking about all the versions of the Japanese airplanes. There were Tonys and Oscars and Nates, but the Zero. They're all Zeros, that's all we knew. And we didn't bother to identify them. The only thing you did was identify them by that red circle, that red meatball on their wing. And it was pretty good identification.
We've been up there protecting the bombers, and when you do that, you have to fly fairly slow because it took them about almost the time they went from Bougainville to Rabaul to get up to 12,000 feet, and we'd be scissoring over them like that.
By weaving, we could always have somebody that was facing out, and you'd come across the bombers and you'd time it, and there's somebody coming the other way, you'd turn behind him. So anybody was coming after him, you were protecting him, and he was doing the same to you. And the safest place to be was in the formation, because there was always somebody facing out. Well, the Zeros tried to get in, and were not very successful. Most of our guys that got a lot of Zeros went out chasing them, left the formation to go after them, and they got suckered away. And invariably, they'd get shot down.
At the beginning, what we would do is escort bombers. We'd escort the Air Force bombers, Navy.
We were protecting mostly the SBD, the dive bombers, the TBF, Avenger, torpedo plane, and Marine Corps B-25s.
We'd get airborne, we'd join up, I don't know where they came from, and after the mission was over, I don't know where they went. No, I never did get to talk to a B-24 pilot, or I talked to some of the SBD pilots because they were Marines.
One time when we were escorting B-24s from the Army Air Force, they were going up to bomb in the Rabaul area. And so on the way up, I pulled up and flew close formation on a B-24. And the Air Force guys in the fuselage, you know, with the doors open, they'd wave at us and they'd go like this, you know. They were happy to see us there.
The dive bombers and torpedo planes would probably fly at about 12,000 feet. By the time they got above the target, we would be just maybe 15,000 feet or something like that over them. And when they would go down, we'd tangle with the Tonys and the Zeeks.
The fighter pilots on top, and the dive bombers in the next layer, and the turkeys or the torpedo bombers. That's the normal approach to a attack an island, a fleet, or whatever. With the fighter pilots protecting the dive bombers and the torpedo bombers.
Thatch, lieutenant commander in the Navy, an old-time man, designed what they call the Thatch weave, which has been pretty well adopted by everybody, and either your 2 planes or a division of 4 planes would weave back and forth, especially if you were taking the bombers in. And what you do is you'd be protecting each other's tail. So if somebody came in from here, this guy here would just go in there and meet him head on, or this guy here would meet the other guy head on.
You could weave with 2 airplanes, with 4 airplanes, or 16 airplanes to defend, so that when you could turn toward each other, and so you could have guns bearing on the enemy if they were attacking you. And a couple of them weren't too proficient at it, and they ran together in the air.
It is both a defensive and an offensive maneuver. The object being that you bring your guns to bear on anything that approaches your flight. When you go with bombers or a slower airplane, the weave also makes your speed more compatible with theirs, because we had to reduce speed as a fighter plane.
But on one mission to Bougainville, the island of Kahili, we had about 16 or 18 airplanes up, and I think we were escorting B-24s. They had dropped their bombs on the airport at Kahili. Of course, the Zeros came in. They tried to go after, make a head-on run, but the mission is over. We're heading home now. We're free. What a wonderful feeling that is. You made it. But suddenly over the radio, we heard this B-17 or B-24 saying, "Hey, I need help. I'm shot up and the Zeros are all over me." And so I peeled around to go back and find this B-24. The whole squadron was there. The whole squadron met that B-24 and got him out. Yes, I do remember it very well.
We were escorting
B-24 Liberators, and one was crippled, and it was down in the water, and I met this Zero head-on on the water, and he chickened out first and pulled up, and when he pulled up, well, all I had to do was just put the pipper in front of him and give him a few squirts, and I saw pieces fly off and everything else, but that was the first Zero that I shot down, practically on the water.
It's kind of gratifying to know that you could go home and make believe you hadn't heard the message. Everybody heard it. Everybody went after him.
And I followed Pappy up on a loop, which he was a pro at it, and the Jap was almost going to outloop him, and he blew him up right at the top. And what happened, pieces of the Japanese plane ended up in the leading edges of his plane, and he had oil all over his windshield. So I pulled up beside him, I stepped up on him like this, and I looked down at him. He's got the hood open, he's trying to run the oil off his windshield. Wouldn't be, it just made a mess. We had to go home.
Well, the best chance that I had for a Zero was, and you have to understand that there was a lot of competition up there among the Corsair pilots, especially the Black Sheep, to score. And I was just coming in on trying to get close enough to shoot this Zero, and I saw tracers going past me, and I thought, geez, the Jap must be on my tail. Well, I looked around to see a Corsair shooting from way back here at the same Zero that I was after. So I thought, buddy, if you want him that bad, you got him, and I just broke off the engagement.
There's really no emotion, and there's no sound, there's no chatter, and there's no exciting voices. There's no exciting voices. It's just what somebody has to say. It's always that way. Even in an emergency, the things you see in the movies is not so. Every emergency I've had a lot of them, besides the ones I've talked to you about. The first thing that happens to you is you get calm. You speak calmly, you speak quietly, you speak distinctly, definitively. You have things that has to be said because you might only get one opportunity to say them. It's the same way in a dogfight or an attack. It's silence, so you don't reveal your position.
That particular day that Pappy was shot down, about 3 days before that, I had dysentery, and I was running to the John at night, and I tripped over a tent wire and sprained my wrist. Doc Reams, our squadron flight surgeon, said, Bob, you can't fly with that wrist because you're jeopardized the whole squadron. So he wouldn't let me fly. Well, George Ashman was the guy that was supposed to fly on Pappy's wing. And George Ashman, he had a problem with a little bit of malaria. And I came to the conclusion I could take his flight if you'll cross his name off the board and put my name on the board, so we'll know who's in that airplane. As I got ready to taxi out after Pappy's taken off in the dark, Doc Reams pulled up in a Jeep in front of me. He held up a red flashlight, and he could take your wings away from you. So he wouldn't let me go. I'm sorry, but that saved my life, because Pappy was up over a ball. There were cirrus clouds there. He went below the cirrus clouds. His wingman went down with him. George Ashman, the rest of the guys that were above, they didn't follow him down, and 8 Japs jumped him.
One early morning, I watched him taking off. He was flying plane 915, and he got shot down that morning.
Well, the day that Pappy was shot down, there was a gaggle of Zeros that attacked the formation, and they opened up right away on the leader, Mollington, and his wingman. They both got shot up pretty bad. 20 millimeter it hit his dashboard and blew everything up. Pappy shot down 2 planes that day, and George Ashman, his wingman, shot down another plane. George Ashman was probably killed because he went into a straight dive and went into the water. But George was shot up so badly, he just didn't make it, and he went in the drink. And Pappy was shot up to the point where he was losing altitude and was down pretty close to the water, and decided he just had enough room to bail out. And there's 2 versions. One say that he jettisoned himself right through the canopy by pushing the stick forward. And the other was that he did get the canopy back and bailed out.
He kicked the stick forward and bailed out and rolled over, and his leg hit the horizontal stabilizer on the tail, and that broke his leg.
He pulled his ripcord right away, and his chute opened just before he hit the water. And he had been shot up pretty badly physically.
He pulled his Mae West, and that was full of shrapnel, so that didn't work. But his life raft did work. So he did get into his life raft. Now he sees a submarine coming. The submarine's coming, and he thought, good, this is over Rabaul. That submarine is probably one of ours. It was a Japanese submarine, and they took a logging pole to get a hold of Pappy.
And he became a prisoner of war for something like 15 months before he was rescued. Well, we didn't think this could ever happen. And if it happened to Pappy, once again we got the feeling, boy, oh boy, it's getting rough out there. And Pappy had always said, fellas, if I ever get shot down, I guarantee you that I'll be back someday and I'll buy you all drinks in San Francisco.
12 Tojos pop out of the cloud. They're kind of look like a P-47, and they were really the new state of the art. But as soon as we went at them, they just spread all over the sky. 3 of the guys shot one down, and the rest of them all disappeared in the clouds. I chased one in the clouds and never caught them.
And it was a nice day like this, and it was warm, and 4 of us were under the wings just soaking up the sun, having a good time. The damn siren went off, and we scrambled, and the guy that had the flight lead was Captain Johnson, and he was in a hurry. We never even stopped to check the mags, and we went up, and they vectored us up to 20 grand going up, and we had tanks on, we dropped the tanks, charged the guns, and so forth. And then when we got up there, you know, you're so naive in the beginning, you don't know what the hell's going on. And I looked over and I saw 24 planes coming in, and I thought, gee, that's a nice formation, you know, it really is. And of course then I saw the ack-ack from the destroyers going up, and we knew what it was. And we got up above them by a couple of thousand, and that was a good position because we had the sun behind us, and they never saw us coming. Johnson went in, and he started firing, and I was on his wing, and then one of them caught fire, and another one, to my surprise, they parachuted out. And we spent about, maybe 15 minutes in that particular fight. And I never, you know, you're supposed to say you never lose your wingman, but I never saw another Corsair after that initial breakup except one we almost ran into. And then I looked up and there were 2 other planes, and I thought, well, there's no use going after those because I think most of my ammunition is gone, number one. And then I saw another plane approaching head on, and I turned into that, and that was a Corsair. And the guy, he was alone, and he picked up the mic and he said something like, hello, Fox 1 or something, and he said, anything going on out here? I said to him, where the hell were you 10 minutes ago? Because it was a pretty good fight for a while. So we ended up with 8. There was so much going down in flames and everything, I thought that, you know, we were losing our guys because of the odds. But when I finally got back there, I was the last one in, and they thought I had been shot down. And actually, nobody in that particular flight got beat up too much. It was a good show.
They had taken LSTs and leveled the deck and put anti-aircraft guns on them, and they had 3 or 4 with each radar picket ship, and that's made it tough for the guys that were providing air cover, because when kamikazes came in, you had to go in and try to get them, and you were receiving as much gunfire as anybody.
Griffin got the Navy Cross for diving through Japanese, or through our own anti-aircraft to splash a Japanese kamikaze about to dive into another ship. And then later on, he got killed down at South Carolina, Beaufort, I think it was.
When you go looking for them, that's kind of a thrill. And this particular flight at the end of the war, I think it was the 4th of July. Colonel Young of 311 was the flight leader. He was senior. I think he was a major then. And he had eight airplanes. My division leader, Pappy Lynch, the Boston Irishman, was kind of a quiet guy. The biggest compliment I got out of him was a pat on the back. And if everything was okay, he'd reach over and pat you on the back. And that was a lot, because he was kind of outstanding fighter pilot. I was his wingman, and he was the other 8 plane. We flew up as 16 planes. The general rule, if you have an abort, one plane abort, your division has to go back with them. Well, we had one abort, and they went back. And we were going along a little further, we had another abort, and they went back. And by this time, my airplane was just weary. My airplane was just weary. I was flying 2200 and 30 inches, and everybody else was using 18 and 30. But I had to really beat my airplane to stay with them. And it hurts to do that when you know you're beating up your airplane, because you're getting so you like your airplane. You always fly it tender when you can. When you have to, you let it all hang out. I couldn't stay in, and I was determined not to abort, because if I had aborted, the whole flight would have had to gone back. I think we was about 22,000 feet above an overcast. Was well up over Kyushu. We spotted 2 big groups of Japs. But I saw this. By the time he gave me the wiggle waggle, and he'd gone. I wanted to be the first one there, but I hesitated just enough, and I ended up being the last one in. I got 2 of them. They were airplanes all over the sky, and I got a laggard that had pulled up, probably away from my buddies, had pulled up, and I was, by then we had an altitude advantage, and even though I pulled up, I shot past him. I had a good shot all the way into him, and shot right on past him, and I claimed him, because he's dead. I didn't look for him. Didn't seek him out, didn't look for him. He was there. Then after I was still, the Corsair, you know, I was going like blazes. And on the way out, there's probably a couple of his buddies I still see, still flying by. I'm on my way home, and I shot at 2 others. They'd already called us to leave the target area, because Pappy had been hit. My division leader had been hit, and I'm his wingman, and the only reason you're a wingman is to protect your leader.
I was flying on a guy named Robert Ewing. We lost my section leader. We don't know where he went either, because no one saw him shot down. Somebody saw him with a Jap on his tail, but it was a melee, because it's like putting bumblebees in a glass jar and shaking it up, and they're flying every which way. And you had real problems sometimes identifying whether you were shooting at one of your own or shooting at a zero, because they're coming in this melee all over.
Sometimes you'd be in a dog fight, and you'd find guys floating down the airplanes here, and in 5 cubic miles you'd have 100 airplanes trying to kill each other, and it was such a melee. And
the only other transmission that I remember is Pappy says, "I'm hit, I'm burning." He got shot up, was spinning down, his ammo cans were exploding. He thought he was going to have to bail out, but he recovered, just barely got back to Shimu Field, and bailed out over the field because he couldn't land it. I have little recall of anything that, except the emotion, my emotion of Pappy being shot, and I'm not with him. And I even had the fleeting thought that I didn't want to go home. It's not really a true thought, but I felt so awful, because I'm a fighter pilot's wingman, and I lost my leader in a dogfight, and I don't talk about it much. It's hard to talk about it, but.
Red Truax and Denver Smitty, who got involved with a whole batch of Japanese fighters over Kyushu, Japan. And Red got credit for one, actually probably shot more than those down. And the leader of the squadron, a fellow by the name of Joe Lynch, a captain, shot down 2 Japs on that day. He became an ace on that day. And I was really feeling sorry for myself, because my 2 roommates, my 2 flying roommates had both made flight kills, and I hadn't.
He got 2 planes, and my buddy Smitty from Flint, Michigan got one, and I got one, and I think there were more planes shot down, honestly, than were claimed, because nobody could confirm anything. And, but everybody saw planes spinning in all over the place with parachutes and smoke.
But in Okinawa, they were having so many kamikaze attacks. I think somebody told me there were 1,000 planes at one time. They were just ruining our ships.
And a couple of times during some of the kamikaze raids there, I got my shots in on some of them were old biplanes.
A mission came down to go take a late afternoon reconnaissance mission, and so I grabbed that, and I had my division, which included me and 3 other aircraft, and a Navy F-6F division, which was land-based for the time being. So we had 8 aircraft, and it was after 4 p.m., and usually we didn't work that late. I got up near Rabaul, and one of my wingmen said, "Hey, Major, there's an aircraft coming up." So we saw a formation of Zeeks or Hamps, and I thought, well, this time you got a chance. Don't screw it up like you did last time. So I took a nice angle down on this formation climbing, and when I was still a little bit out of range, I started firing my guns, and what I did this time, I just simply put my tracers well ahead of the nose of the aircraft, because I was coming in at an angle, maybe a 45-degree angle, and I just walked the tracers back through the aircraft, and you know what happened? He blew up. It was amazing.
650s were quite effective. I caught one airplane at moderate range, probably 600 feet, something like that. And the guns came together right in his cockpit. And the way you can tell if you're hitting them is because the tracers, you hit something, the tracer bounces off, and you know you're hitting them. But I blew that one apart.
It was one of our biggest days as far as shooting down planes from around Okinawa. And I was on high cap, and we sat up there in circle and circle, and the planes were coming in, and they were losing the destroyers. I saw several destroyers get hit and sink.
There were a bunch of planes every place in the area.
But they wouldn't let us come down because they were expecting some high altitude to come in. And finally they turned us loose. So we saw where some planes were coming in and dove down, and they were doing about 150 knots, and we were doing about 400 coming down from 25,000 feet. And I dropped my gear and dropped flaps and stuck my head out, arms out the window, everything I could to slow down, but finally got slowed down enough to pull in behind one of those old biplanes and got my shots in on him.
The first fella, he hit the plane, and apparently for some reason or another, there were 2 people in that plane. It was a Val, too. It was a dive bomber type plane. And the person in the rear seat, say at 300 feet above the water, bailed out, pulled his chute.
He got tired of getting shot at, so he jumped out and pulled his rip cord, and there wasn't nothing but rags coming out when I saw him hit the water.
For why he was in there, I have no idea. And I guess they didn't want to waste a parachute on him. So when the plane got hit, he bailed out and pulled his chute, and these rags floated down, and of course he was gone and hit the water, and out at sea anyway. And then I shot the plane down at a few seconds later. We wound up, the other 2 planes was low on fuel, number 3 and 4, so they had to leave. And my wingman and I stayed, and all of a sudden there was a Nate. So I pulled over the side and told Van Salter, who was my wingman, you go ahead and take this one. Well, he was on a head-on to that Nate, and just before he got in firing range, the Nate just rolled on his back and pulled right in. He was only 300 or 400 feet off and just splashed himself in the water just before. And Van Zalter was mad as a wet hen because he was about to shoot him there. He killed himself. And I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, you ran him in the water, you killed him. But those are crazy things that happen, and why, I can't explain them.
I was with a group of 6 guys, and we were on combat air patrol at the north end of Okinawa. And we intercepted them. They were kamikazes, and we shot them all down within about, I only had 2.5 runs on them before they were burning, you know.
When we went up to Okinawa, we had electric gun heaters that fitted over the guns so we could fly at high altitude. I hate to say, one of the enlightenments of the Marine Corps, they took them away from us. I don't know whether they thought we were going to fly at low altitude the whole time or what. But as soon as we went above about 25,000 feet, unless they had very carefully put on a little bit of oil on the guns, they would freeze, and you couldn't use them. And this one day, this Nick had been flying around the island, taking pictures. It was a twin-engine fighter, but they were using a photo plane, taking pictures of all the ships for the kamikazes to attack. They just kept flying around in circles. And on the island next to us, Aishima, was a P-47 outfit. We called P-47 high-altitude foxholes. But they had a good supercharger. And why they didn't send them up after this guy, we don't know. But so Kenny Ricer and Bob Klingman said they were going to get him. So going up, Kenny kept firing all of his ammunition. And Bob didn't do anything to his. And he got to 38,000 feet. And Kenny's ran out of ammunition. He didn't have any left. And Bob was determined that he was going to get that airplane. Bob had been an enlisted man in the ground troops, and gone through flight school and got a commission. And he made one pass by the airplane, cut off part of the tail, with his propeller, this is. Here was a gunner in the back of that airplane going like this. His guns had frozen too. And Bob made a second pass, cut off more of the tail, and the third pass he cut it off right behind where the gunner was, and it crashed. There's one picture out that he lost about that much of one of his blades. They were about 120 miles away. He didn't make it back to the field, although they kept telling him, bail out, you're not going to make it. Your engine, you've run out of gas. But he made it, all the way back to the field. And he ended up with a Navy Cross.
Well, he was up high. He was maybe about 10,000, 12,000 feet. And the radar directed us right out to where he was and set us up behind him. And we came up behind him, and he was doing real slow. So we just fired, and next he tried a half a loop. And by the time he was in the top of his loop, I was still firing at him. And he just went into a spin, and he kept spinning until he was out of sight and burning like crazy.
Fired at him, and he went into a big circle. Well, I think I must have killed the pilot, because he went in a big circle, and I just flew wing on him and followed him around. And the last thing I saw of him, he was down about 50 feet and had his hand up in front of his face protecting himself from the fire from the engine. And I got credit for that one.
The experience of a dogfight is a quick emotion and an interesting debriefing where we all state what we saw.
I have a friend of mine that lives over here in Foley, and he was flying along, and all of a sudden he sees these shots go by him, and he's being shot at, but before he could do anything about it, this MiG pulled up in front of him, and he still had his guns armed, so he just put his, at that time, 420 millimeters on him, and he knocked that guy out of the air. The only thing was that MiG had a buddy back here, and he came around and fired on him, and he had to bail out. And so he's still living over here in Foley. He shot down a MiG with his Corsair.
You could tell when you were down in Guadalcanal how many you shot down, because they were coming to you, bombers and fighters, and sometimes you'd be like 8 fighters to 100 enemy, but they'd shoot down 5 airplanes in one shot and all that kind of stuff, but they they could tell what they were doing. But with us, we had to stay doing this over the bombers all the time, and you'd have a head-on with a zero, and you'd hit him and he'd go off like that, but you didn't have time to look down and see him splash or hit the ground, so you don't really know how many you had.
All the pilots will tell you this. At one time or another, they've done this. 1 minute, there's planes all over the place, and of course, you're either firing on a zero or you're trying to evade it, and all of a sudden, you're in a different part of the sky, and you get back to your original section, and there's nobody around.
When you got in the old-fashioned dog fights, who the hell knew what was going on? You know, you saw something, you pushed the trigger, and the adrenaline pumped, and you came back.
It's just, it was such a melee. You know, just everybody going in all kind of directions.
When you get into that airplane and you get cranked up and you get ready to go, it says, what you do then, you reach up and put one hand on your chin and the other one on the back of your head. And said, you spin that old head and you let it spin all the rest of the time you're out there, 306 degrees. Well, any of those mirrors and the view and everything aided that. And I never forgot that, because you got to see a fellow before you can protect yourself against him or shoot at him.
I was assigned to lead a flight over Caviang just for patrol. Pat Dugan and I took off and went to Rabaul, and I came in a little higher than the patrol altitude. And about 14,000 feet I got abreast of the airfield and looked out, and there was zero taking off. I mentioned that to Pat, and he said, let's go get him. And so, hold on a minute, you know, there's 91 guns down there. This may be a trap. We circled and let down, dropped our bombs, and he was putting on a show for the people on the ground. And he'd fly down one side of the strip and do a quick turn and fly down the other side. And, you know, really a maneuverable airplane. So we watched him, and then he turned out south of the airstrip and over a strip that's being built and turned out to sea, and that's when I dropped on him and shot him down. I dropped in on him, and you know, I got in range, I started shooting, and I fired one long burst and hit him in the engine, and it came back to the cockpit. And I think I got the pilot, because the airplane nosed over and went in the water. You know, it was really fairly simple.
We were proud of them. I mean, they were the heroes to us, because they'd come back and do a roll, we'd know they got somebody, you know.
Well, it pretty soon became evident that there weren't many zeros left to shoot down, and we all regretted that, because, of course, we all wanted to be aces. Quite a few did become aces, but most of them didn't. But that doesn't mean that they weren't just as good. A lot of it depended on the opportunity.
And we would make fighter sweeps, you know, 60 or 70 or 80 fighters go up and, in effect, invite the Japanese to come up and tangle, and they didn't do it. They did it once or twice early, and they just didn't do it anymore, which gave you much less opportunity to shoot any of them down.
And on my last fight in the Corsair at Okinawa a couple of years later, I shot down 5 zeros. Well, what you want, of course, is superior altitude. That's the main thing you want to start a fight with, and we started that one pretty well. We were flying Japanese territory and supporting landing on Okinawa. And we tangled with, well, there were 16 planes on my side in that thing, but only 8 of them were mine, and another squadron was with us. And we got in that fight, and we shot down 16 of the Japanese before they left town, of which I got a little more than my share, 5.
We were trained to do that. That wasn't heroic or anything else. You were trained to do it. If you were in the field where the pheasants were, you would get the pheasants. We were in the field where the pheasants were. We had guys in our squadron, Mike, that never even saw a Zero.
Never had a air-to-air encounter, never saw an enemy airplane. Whole time I was there.
We were vectored towards enemy planes. Many times they were friendlies. And, you know, the systems know better than what's working correctly.
Our group got into Okinawa the latter part of the campaign over there. It was almost over with. I was never vectored out to a Zero, but some of the people that I was flying with, they went on a hop one day, and I was originally on that hop, but I had to come back because my plane was leaking oil, and I got back, and there was less than 3 gallons on the oil. But they continued on to Japan and shot down 12 planes that day.
I just had 2.
2? Okay.
Yeah. I think I probably had about 8, and then a few on the ground.
I ended up shooting down 7 in our division. With me flying wing on Pappy, he shot down anywhere from 26 to 28 airplanes, 6 of them in the Flying Taggers. Second section leader, Chris McGee, he shot down 9, and the guy that flew wing on him shot down 4. So there's 48 airplanes.
Some of the boys in our squadron did quite well as far as records are concerned. In fact, one of our guys shot down 25 airplanes, so that was a pretty fair record. You went on the high side.
The squadron had a total of 119 kills in World War II, and of that total, 55 were scored on Okinawa.
Yeah, we got 29 airplanes, I believe.
I was in 215, VMF 215. We didn't get the publicity that the Black Sheep did, but we shot down 135 airplanes.
We did more close air support than our companion squadron 323, because they picked up 125 airplanes. At the same time, we picked up 69 and a half. And the third squadron, 321, I think only picked up 40 or something like that.
I later met a fella in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. He'd been the mayor of Biloxi at one time. He had the Navy Cross for shooting down 4 of them in one day, flying off of another airfield on Okinawa. He was on Kadena. And he asked me, he said, you have any kills? I said, no. I said, you know, I never actually saw a Zero in flight who would have been in a position that I would have been shooting at him and he at me. And he said, well, we only saw him twice. And he said, I got 4 one time and 1 another time. So you just, at that time, we pretty well controlled the air. And you just, these kamikazes, though, they were something else. We chased them all over the sky.
His division, composed of Major Joe Lynch, Red Truex, the second division leader was Second Lieutenant Smitty, and I forget who his wingman was. They scored 4 kills of that 55, and as I say, I believe that's the last kills that were made during World War II off of Okinawa.
It was wild. It was really wild, and but I can't pick it out as a real highlight. It's a real high. I got a kill, and every fighter pilot likes to get a kill. But my contribution, being a fighter pilot in World War II, was much, much more than that. Much more than that. I mean, you don't go around, you know, I hate to tell people that how many people you've killed and all that sort of stuff, but you had to diminish your enemy. And we sure did that in our squadron.
Something I will never forget is a man that I hit, shot down. I recall he burned, and I can recall just going right by him, and I saw him try to get out of cockpit. Felt sorry for the man. He was a fellow pilot, and it wasn't a good feeling to know that he was not going to make it back to his base at Kahili.
I have about 5 to 10 more hours than anyone else in the squadron. I saw 3 airplanes, and all 3 were on fire. It was a matter of being at the right place at the right time. That's what it really boiled down to.
And some guys were out there doing the same thing, taking the same risk, flying the same airplanes, never shot down anything. They just didn't have the opportunity, that's all. Yeah, they're all heroes. They were there.